Hi there folks, this is the CPD 5 on questioning that we completed on the 2nd of February just last week. If you weren't there or if you just wanted a refresh, I'm going to take you through the CPD slides and a little bit of an overview of what we looked at, and then there's a pledge for you to make at the end. In the initial part of our CPD we had Sarah Hill spoke to us about hearing impaired students. Just a reminder that during things such as choral speaking activities or various call and response activities which we might be doing to kind of foster more participation, we need to be extra aware of our HI, which is hearing impaired students, or EAL, English as an additional language students as well. There are some really concrete tips as to how we can mitigate the circumstances for our students with a hearing impairment. Some of the things that we might want to stop happening is that students might feel kind of very conscious, very anxious about not being able to hear. There's a real sense of hearing fatigue if you're listening all day to kind of an impaired sound. Missed learning, not just in the instance that we're working with on that one lesson, but over time. A sense of potentially being more distracted. Things like hearing aids will amplify all sound, so it can be distracting to have a sort of noisy radiator or a noisy fan. So the adaptations that we can make are that the seating plans, we need to be really sure that we are following the seating plans. If it suggests that a student should be sat at the front, make sure that we've done that. Dual coding is always helpful, but gestures for dual coding as well. And I know that Holly Williams has got some resources around dual coding using AI kind of infographics and images. Positioning yourself in the classroom so that you're close enough to the student that you're going to cold call on. Sarah suggested that we stand really in front of that student and really make sure they've heard the question. Make sure that there's some breaks between listening if there's heavy listening needed for the tasks. And we are thinking about introducing brain breaks as a more sort of official way of ensuring that there are some breaks for that cognitive overload. And just making sure there's some subtle check-ins. A student might not feel that they can come to you to say, I'm in a tricky place in the room. So just regularly checking in with that student, is everything okay for you from a hearing point of view? Next part of the CPD we looked at, just reminding you that on Teams we have got the full resources for the CPD. They're uploaded onto Teams there in terms of things like PowerPoints. And also a reminder that there are the research Twilight Thursday afternoons, and the resources for those are actually now all stored into the CPD underneath Thursday Twilights. You can see here that there's the materials and also the plan and some images that I send out every Thursday as well. When you click on that link for the resources, it comes up with the live sessions, the what to watch, what to read, and then it gives you an indication of what the images are, and the images are stored separately in that resource there. Okay, so in terms of questioning, we were looking at the purpose of questioning as how it might follow on from our participation focus. We want questioning to inspire students, we want it to engage them in some reflection and expressing of their ideas. Good questioning does foster a better sort of participation ratio in our classrooms, and it really helps for students to think about their metacognitive processes as well through questioning. So, last couple of CPDs ago, we did have some sort of pledge where you were going to go and try something to do with questioning. Sorry, I haven't set this PowerPoint up for my face, so I'll just keep moving myself so you can see things. And some of those, the ones in red, really do relate to questioning already. But later on in this CPD, I'm going to be asking you to make a pledge around one of these 4 areas. So cold calling or probing questions, responses to incorrect answers, or students asking questions. I'd like you to make a pledge, and that'll be coming via the evaluation, of one aspect of one of those areas. So cold calling, when we ask a question with cold calling, is to try and break away from a style of questioning where we would use hands up and ask students just to put their hands up to volunteer an answer. The problem with hands up is that it doesn't hit our participation ratio, and we might only hear from those students who really have a strong opinion and are not afraid to share it. So the encouragement here is to try and foster a culture in your classroom of cold calling. If that's with closed questions, so something where there's just one small answer, short, defined answer, we're going to increase our participation ratio, and it can be helpful to use this technique of questioning when you're trying to do retrieval practice. It's not ideal to do closed question cold calling for something that isn't retrieval, because it's just putting the kid on the spot and that's not nice. So the cold calling, if you're doing that, it is worth considering, is that one question to the one student the best way to do this? Or perhaps could I use a more tightly controlled kind of AFL, such as a mini whiteboard, or sort of voting fingers, something where all the students are getting involved, because really, if it's retrieval, everybody should be able to retrieve that information. Open questions with cold calling, we might think of cold calling as just that closed question style, but actually open questions are really nice, but they must ensure that we've given enough of the right conditions for a student to be able to respond in that condition there with an open question. So an increased participation ratio still happens. We do create those opportunities for everybody's voice to be heard, but it really should follow on from thinking time, ideally a think, pair, share with a proper amount of thinking time in there. Okay, so in terms of pledges, I'll have to move myself again, move myself over there. In terms of pledges, I'd like you to consider just one of the following, and it doesn't need to be cold calling if you think that's pretty well embedded in your teaching already. I'll have to move myself right over here, sorry folks. Okay, so you might decide, well actually cold calling's not really embedded yet, and I'm going to take my pledge forward to experiment with no hands up. Or you might decide to go with ensuring enough thinking time. It really is a lot shorter than you think that teachers tend to give. So we tend to give about 10 seconds when 30 seconds is ideal. So you might want to use a stopwatch for that. You might want to experiment with using resources for open questioning, and that includes that thinking time. We might want to make sure that we've prepared students who might have low self-efficacy, maybe with a prepared answer on a post-it note, or sort of giving them slightly more of a heads up that they're going to be cold called. So a pledge around cold calling would be one option following this CPD. Okay, so probing questions. This is another pledge that you might potentially make. And this is where we don't just kind of accept an answer and think, oh, job's done, the student's understood. We kind of dig a bit deeper into their response, encouraging further explanation or clarification. When we look at the handbook, the Teacher Learning Handbook, there are lots of other types of questions. I focused on probing questions here, but if you think, again, that probing questions are quite embedded in your practice, you might pledge to use one of these this style of questioning, something, for example, like hypothetical questions you might want to experiment with. So digging deeper into the student response, how do we do this? What's it like? Well, we must make sure that we don't just take their correct answer as a kind of indicator of the fact that they've learnt or known something. We need to make sure that we ask students to justify, explain, expand on their own answers. And crucially, especially for that participation ratio, we want to make sure that they're actually expanding or able to expand on the answers given by other people as well. It might be that with certain groups you might want to experiment with the idea of them giving a sort of exam-ready verbal response, kind of practising speaking in that more expansive way that they would have to write if they were in an exam. So the probing questions, you might ask a student, how do you know that? How do you know that what you've said to me is right? You might want to experiment with asking students to explain why something is true that they've given you an answer for. You might ask students, that's great that you know that. How does that link to anything else that's a pre-existing schema? So how does that link into other knowledge? And is there anything that you would ask the students to, what would they sort of think somebody would say if there was a challenge to their assertion? So sort of like, what would somebody say if they were arguing against what you've just said? So that's really particularly good for those humanities subjects. Okay, supporting students to find the right answer. This is where we're responding to those incorrect answers. It's really important if we get an incorrect answer, it's good to kind of push a little bit, but we don't want to flog a dead horse. So if the students just don't know, potentially our questioning was flawed, because potentially they're being asked a sort of cold, closed question on something that they just simply don't have as secure knowledge. So don't flog a dead horse, make sure the student feels really comfortable in your lesson. But you can ask students, if they give you an incorrect answer, to kind of use their resources. What's on the wall of the wall display? What's in their book? What's sort of on the board at the moment? What have we just done earlier in the lesson with their notes? So really asking them to dig into a range of resources. And you might use your knowledge of the unit and of the student and of your relationship and of funny things that have happened in the class to kind of hark back to help them find that answer. You might sort of think, oh, I've asked them a question here and they've got it wrong. Right, I could ask something slightly different. I might ask a more scaffolded question. I might break it down. I might ask something that's going to then lead them to the right answer. In the handbook, we do have a range of things that you can look at for how to respond to incorrect answers. So do look back at the Teacher Learning Handbook to help you with that. So in your pledge, you might pledge that you're going to use some scaffolding towards the right answer. You might decide that you're going to try and get students to use resources as a sort of standard way of responding to an incorrect answer. You might make some resources. Now, I was reluctant to put this one into the CPD because I don't want people to go off and have to make loads and loads of different things. But it might be as simple as a resource that's reusable, so a quick sort of guide sheet. Or you might sort of think ahead when you're making new resources, how could these become an aid memoir? How are they easily sort of signposting students to help them use them for common errors? And you might ask the student a question, they give a wrong answer, and you might say, right, well, I'm going to explain to you why that is the answer you've given to me. It is wrong, but here's why I think you've made it, and it's a common misconception that students have. Okay, so finally we want to potentially make our pledge today around students thinking deeply. I'd want to encourage you to not say, any questions? Kind of just wait for them to respond. I'd encourage you to say, what are your questions? Or this is the time for you to ask your questions. And to really encourage and praise students who do ask questions, and really if they ask specific questions. We don't want, how do I do it? How do I do this? That's too vague. So really specific questions for your specific subject would be really encouraged. So your pledge might be to use a phrase such as what are your questions? So I'm trying to move myself out of the way there. You might pledge to scaffold the sorts of questions that students might ask. So you might give them some sentence stems or give them examples of the kind of questions that students might have asked in previous lessons. You might predict a range of questions and actually share them as part of your learning. And you might want to try and allow some anonymity. Students might feel that they can't ask questions because they sort of seem a little bit keen, and that's a culture that's hard to break. But if you ask via a homework, possibly on a Microsoft Forms, or even one teacher in the CPD suggested that we get them to do this in their book, and they could use a post-it note or they could just write into their book a question so that when you mark the books you can see what the questions are that the students have asked. Any way to make it anonymous but still facilitates them asking questions. So final steps here, we'd like you to make a pledge, and it's just one of those steps. So on the little mind maps for each of those 4 areas, just one of the strands off the mind map. So you might pledge to just ask students, what are your questions? And you're going to practice that repeatedly over different lessons over the next half term. Share this pledge with a colleague. So I'm going to ask you via the Blue Sky People Development Evaluation. I'm going to ask you to share the pledge with me, but it'd be really good to share it with a colleague or even with your classes so that there's sort of that accountability partner to check in with you. You'll be asked for feedback on the pledge formally at the end of next spring half term. So consider how your questioning adaptations will positively impact your participation ratio, how they foster oracy, and it might be that you want to use these questioning techniques to stretch or challenge your students or to support those that have a lack of self-efficacy. So when you're making your pledge, it might be interesting to think about what your particular areas are with your classes. You can pick a pledge to work with one class or a type of student across classes, a key stage, all your classes, your exam classes. It doesn't need to be every single lesson, but I would like you to think about which pledge you're going to make and to be ready to share that with us. I asked at the end if there were any questions. If you do have your questions, please make sure that you email me and I'll try to respond to those. Thanks for listening.